The Arizona sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty main street of Dust Haven, where the monthly bride auction was drawing to its pitiful close. The wooden platform creaked under the weight of disappointment and desperation, its planks warped from too many seasons of this particular brand of frontier commerce. Eloise Whitfield stood alone on that platform, her Charleston breeding evident in the straightness of her spine, despite the humiliation burning in her chest. 24 years old, with auburn hair pinned severely back and a traveling dress that had seen better days. She was what the auctioneer called the last lot of the day. The crowd had thinned considerably since noon, leaving only the dregs of society, men too drunk, too poor, or too cruel to have claimed the prettier, younger women who'd gone before. Gentlemen. The auctioneer, a greasy man named Josiah Pike, mopped his brow with a yellowed handkerchief. We have here Miss Eloise Whitfield, recently arrived from South Carolina. She can read, write, and cipher. Knows her way around a kitchen and a needle. Strong constitution. No visible ailments. A few men in the crowd snickered. One spat tobacco juice into the dirt. "Why's she covering her wrist like that?" called out a man with missing teeth. "She hiding something." Eloise's hand moved unconsciously to her left wrist, where her sleeve and a thin leather bracelet concealed the long scar that ran from palm to forearm, the mark of her survival, her shame, her reason for being here at all. "Starting bid is $20, Pike continued, his voice losing its showman's enthusiasm. Even he seemed eager to end this charade. Silence stretched across the square like a taut wire. A tumbleweed rolled past the platform, the only movement in the suffocating afternoon heat. Somewhere, a dog barked. $15, Pike tried again, desperation creeping into his voice. "Come now, gentlemen, she's educated. That's worth something." "Education don't make the stew taste better," someone muttered, earning a few harsh laughs. Eloise kept her eyes fixed on the horizon, past the ramshackle buildings and false-fronted stores, past the cemetery on the hill where wooden crosses leaned at drunken angles. She thought of her mother's parlor in Charleston, of the piano she'd never play again, of the scandal that had driven her west. Better to be sold as a bride than to face what waited for her back home. $10, Pike's voice cracked. "Surely someone?" "I'll take her." The voice came from the back of the crowd, low and rough as sandpaper. Heads turned to see a man stepping forward from the shadow of Murphy's saloon. He moved with the careful gait of someone who'd learned not to trust the ground beneath his feet, his spurs ringing a lonely rhythm against the packed earth. Cassidy Cass Blackwood was known in Dust Haven the way one knew a local legend, in whispers and warnings. 6 feet of lean muscle and old grief, with dark hair that needed cutting and eyes the color of winter sky. His face bore the weathering of a man who'd spent too many years squinting into harsh sunsets, and his hands, when they emerged from his coat pockets, showed the scars of hard living. The crowd parted for him like the Red Sea, though whether from respect or fear was hard to say. That's Blackwood," someone whispered. "Man's been living alone out at Widow's Bluff since—" "Hush up," another voice cut in. "Don't speak of it." Pike swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing like a fishing cork. "Mr. Blackwood, sir, the bid stands at $20. "I'll pay it." Cass reached into his coat and withdrew a leather pouch, counting out the coins with methodical precision. His movements were economical, controlled, like a man who'd learned to conserve everything, even gestures. For the first time since mounting the platform, Eloise looked directly at her purchaser. Their eyes met across the distance, hers hazel and defiant despite her circumstances, his gray and unreadable as stone. Something passed between them in that moment, though neither could have said what. Recognition, perhaps, though they'd never met. Or maybe it was simply one damaged soul acknowledging another. "Sold." Pike banged his gavel with unseemly haste, eager to conclude this uncomfortable business. "To Mr. Cassidy Blackwood for $20. May the Lord bless this union." The irony of the blessing wasn't lost on anyone. The Lord had little to do with bride auctions, and everyone knew it. Cass approached the platform with the same careful steps. Reaching up to offer Eloise his hand, she hesitated, studying the calluses and scars that mapped his palm like a geography of loss. Then, having no other choice, she placed her gloved hand in his and allowed him to help her down. "Ma'am," he said simply, touching the brim of his hat. "Mr. Blackwood," she replied, her voice steady despite the tremor in her chest. "My wagon's outside town. We've got a ways to ride before dark." She nodded, gathering her single carpet bag, all that remained of her former life. As they walked through the dispersing crowd, she heard the whispers following in their wake like tumbleweeds. "Poor woman. Doesn't know what she's getting into. Blackwood hasn't spoken more than 10 words to anyone since the fire. Maybe she'll be good for him. Maybe she'll end up like—" "Hush." The wagon waited where Cass had said, a sturdy, if plain conveyance pulled by 2 bay horses that looked better cared for than most animals in Dust Haven. He helped her up to the bench seat with surprising gentleness, then climbed up beside her, taking the reins with practiced ease. As they rolled out of town, Eloise stole glances at her new husband, for that's what he would be, once they found a preacher or a justice of the peace. His profile was sharp against the afternoon light, all angles and shadows. His hands on the reins were steady, competent. He didn't look at her, didn't speak, just guided the horses along the rutted track that led north toward the mesa. The silence between them was complete, but not entirely uncomfortable. After the humiliation of the auction, the leering faces and crude comments, his quiet felt almost like a kindness. She adjusted her skirts, trying to find a comfortable position on the hard wooden seat, and noticed him glance at her from the corner of his eye. "It's 3 hours to my place," he said finally, his voice rough from disuse. "There's water in the canteen if you're thirsty." "Thank you." She didn't reach for it. Not yet. "Mr. Blackwood." "Cass." "Cass?" The name felt strange on her tongue. "May I ask why?" He was quiet so long she thought he wouldn't answer. The horses plodded on, their hooves raising small clouds of dust that hung in the still air. A hawk circled overhead, its cry lonesome as a funeral bell. "Couldn't abide it," he said at last. "You standing there like that? Them laughing." He shifted the reins to one hand, rubbing the back of his neck with the other. "Man shouldn't laugh at someone's misfortune." "And you know about misfortune?" It wasn't a question. She'd heard enough of the whispers to understand that Cassidy Blackwood was a man acquainted with grief. "I know enough." They rode in silence after that, the landscape gradually changing from the flat dustiness of Dust Haven to rolling hills dotted with mesquite and juniper. The sun began its slow descent toward the western mountains, painting the clouds in shades of rose and gold. Despite everything, the auction, the uncertainty of her future, the strange, silent man beside her, Eloise found herself moved by the terrible beauty of this wild country. "Your wrist," Cass said suddenly. "You don't have to hide it, not from me." Her hand went automatically to the covered scar. "How did you—" "Way you hold it. Seen men do the same with old wounds, bullet scars, knife marks." He kept his eyes on the road ahead. "We all got our marks, Miss Whitfield. Yours just happened to show more than most." She studied him then, this man who'd paid $20 for a wife he didn't know. His own scars weren't visible, perhaps, but she could see them in the tightness around his eyes. The careful way he held himself, as if he were made of glass and might shatter at any sudden movement. "It's Eloise," she said softly. "If we're to be, that is, if you intend for us to be married—" "Tomorrow," he said. "There's a preacher comes through Willow Creek first Sunday of the month. That's tomorrow. If you're willing." "And if I'm not—" He turned to look at her then. Really look at her. And she saw something in his gray eyes that might have been understanding, or perhaps it was recognition. One lost soul seeing another clearly. Then you're free to go. I'm not your jailer. Eloise never will be. You stay because you choose to, or you don't stay at all." The words hung between them as the wagon rolled on through the gathering dusk. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled, and others took up the call until the hills rang with their wild music. Eloise pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders and made her choice. "Then I choose to stay. For now." He nodded once, returning his attention to the horses. "For now," he agreed. As the first stars began to prick the darkening sky, Eloise allowed herself to hope that perhaps this strange, broken man might offer her something the good people of Charleston never had: the freedom to be equally broken, equally scarred, and equally human. The wagon rolled on through the desert night, carrying two damaged souls toward an uncertain future, while behind them, the lights of Dust Haven faded like dying embers in the dark. The house at Widow's Bluff stood like a lonely sentinel against the darkening sky, its wooden frame weathered to the color of old bones. As the wagon crested the final hill, Eloise caught her first glimpse of what would be her new home, a modest structure of logs and timber. With a stone chimney and a porch that wrapped around two sides, it was neither grand nor squalid, but something in between, like a place waiting to be lived in again. Cass brought the wagon to a stop near a small barn, climbing down without a word to tend to the horses. Eloise remained on the bench, uncertain whether to follow or wait for instruction. The silence here was different from the silence of their journey. Deeper, older, heavy with the weight of unspoken stories. "You can go on in," Cass said without looking at her, his hands working to unhitch the team. "Door's not locked, never is. Light the lamp if you've a mind to." She climbed down carefully, her legs stiff from the long ride, and retrieved her carpet bag from the wagon bed. The porch steps creaked under her weight, a mournful sound in the gathering darkness. True to his word, the door opened at her touch, revealing an interior shrouded in shadow. The match she struck illuminated a surprisingly neat space. The main room served as both kitchen and living area, with a large fireplace dominating one wall. A table with two chairs sat near a window, and shelves lined with preserves and dry goods occupied another wall. Everything was clean, orderly, but somehow lifeless, like a museum display of frontier living rather than an actual home. She lit the oil lamp on the table, its warm glow pushing back the shadows to reveal more details. A rifle hung above the fireplace. Cast iron pots sat ready on the stove. A braided rug covered part of the floor, its colors faded but patterns still visible. Through an open doorway, she glimpsed what must be the bedroom, though she quickly looked away, her cheeks warming at the implications. The front door opened and Cass entered, carrying an armload of wood. He moved with the same careful precision she'd noticed before, stacking the logs beside the fireplace without meeting her eyes. "I'll sleep in the barn tonight," he said, brushing wood dust from his hands. Until tomorrow, after the preacher." "That's not necessary. I trust it's necessary." His tone brooked no argument. "There's food in the larder. Creek's out back if you need water. Privy's behind the house, to the left." He turned to go, but paused at the door. In the lamplight, she could see the lines etched deep around his eyes, the weariness that seemed to emanate from his very bones. "Why did you really buy me?" The question escaped before she could stop it. He was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Couldn't stand to see another good thing destroyed by this place. Not again." Before she could ask what he meant, he was gone, the door closing softly behind him. Alone in the strange house, Eloise set about exploring her new surroundings. The bedroom contained a narrow bed with a cornhusk mattress, a washstand, and a small wardrobe. Men's clothes hung inside, worn but clean, smelling faintly of soap and cedar. On the washstand sat a straight razor, a cracked mirror, and, surprisingly, a small vase holding dried wildflowers. their colors long faded to brown. She returned to the main room and investigated the larder, finding it well stocked with beans, flour, salt pork, and other frontier staples. Her stomach reminded her she hadn't eaten since morning, so she set about preparing a simple meal. As she worked, she found herself falling into the familiar rhythms of cooking, letting the mundane task calm her racing thoughts. The stove drew well, and soon she had beans simmering and cornbread baking. The domestic sounds, the pop of the fire, the bubble of the pot filled the empty house with a semblance of life. She set 2 places at the table out of habit, then stared at the extra plate, wondering if she should take it to the barn. But something in Cass's manner had warned her against intrusion, so she ate alone. The empty chair across from her a reminder of all the questions she couldn't yet ask. After washing the dishes, noting how he'd arranged everything within easy reach, how worn smooth the pump handle was from use, she prepared for bed. In her carpet bag, beneath her few dresses and underthings, lay her journal, one of the few luxuries she'd managed to keep. She sat at the table and opened it to a fresh page, dipping her pen in the ink she'd carefully transported across half a continent. Asterisk May 15th, 1879, Widow's Bluff, Arizona Territory, asterisk. Asterisk. She was the last bride left at the border town auction. Then a broken cowboy raised his hand. That was me. That was him. And now here I sit in his empty house, trying to make sense of what comes next. The man, Cassidy Blackwood, though he prefers Cass's, is a mystery wrapped in grief. The townspeople whispered of a fire, of loss, but the details remain unclear. Asterisk. The house tells its own story. Everything is too neat, too ordered, as if he's afraid that letting disorder creep in might invite chaos. There are no pictures on the walls, no personal touches save for those dried flowers by his washstand. A woman's touch, or his own attempt at bringing beauty to this austere place. Asterisk. Asterisk, I should be frightened. I'm alone in the wilderness with a stranger who bought me like livestock. Yet I find myself more curious than afraid. There's something in his eyes, a recognition, perhaps, of shared damage. He saw my scar without seeing it, knew to offer freedom rather than possession. Asterisk. Not every cage has locks. Some are made of silence. I wrote those words once before, but here, in this quiet house, they take on new meaning. Tomorrow we marry. Tomorrow I become Mrs. Blackwood. Tonight, I'm still Eloise Whitfield, though I'm no longer sure who that is. A sound outside made her look up from her writing. Through the window, she could see a faint glow from the barn lamplight seeping through the cracks in the wall. She imagined Cass there, bedded down in the hay like a stable hand rather than the owner of the property. What kind of man chose such exile from his own home? Unable to settle, she wrapped her shawl around her shoulders and stepped onto the porch. The night sky blazed with more stars than she'd ever seen in Charleston. The Milky Way, a river of light across the heavens. The air was cool, carrying the scent of sage and something else. Rain. Perhaps, though the sky was clear. A movement by the corral caught her eye. Cass stood there, one hand on the neck of a bay horse, speaking too low for her to hear the words. The animal's ears flicked forward, and it whickered softly in response. There was a tenderness in the gesture that surprised her, a glimpse of the man he might have been before whatever tragedy had carved those lines into his face. She thought about calling out, perhaps offering to share the coffee she'd noticed on the stove, kept warm out of habit for someone who no longer came to drink it. But something held her back. Instead, she pulled the small knife from her boot, a habit from the road, and felt its familiar weight. She'd kept it close that first night in every place she'd stayed since leaving Charleston. But looking at the man gentle with his horses, the neat house waiting patiently for life to return, she made a decision. Back inside, she tucked the knife into her carpet bag, burying it beneath her clothing. If Cass had meant her harm, he'd had ample opportunity. Whatever else he wasn't that kind of threat. She prepared for bed, wearing her traveling dress for lack of proper night clothes. The narrow mattress was surprisingly comfortable, the quilts clean and smelling of lavender, another mystery in this house of contradictions. As she lay in the darkness, she could hear the wind picking up outside, rattling the shutters like skeletal fingers. Sleep eluded her for a long time. Her mind kept returning to Cass's words. Couldn't stand to see another good thing destroyed. Another. The word held weight, implications, a story she wasn't yet privileged to know. She thought of the whispers in town, the mentions of fire, the way people looked at him with a mixture of pity and fear. In Charleston, she'd been the subject of whispers too. Poor Eloise Whitfield. They'd said, such a shame about the scandal. That unfortunate incident with the Marsden boy. No decent family will have her now. The scar on her wrist throbbed with remembered pain, and she rubbed it absently through the fabric of her sleeve. Perhaps that's what Cass had recognized in her, not just damage, but the particular kind that came from being blamed for your own wounds, the kind that made people look at you and see only the story they'd already written in their minds. A coyote howled in the distance, answered by another, then another, until the night filled with their wild chorus. She'd been terrified of them during her journey west, but now their calls seemed almost welcoming, the greeting of one exile to another. When she finally dozed, she dreamed of fire and flowers, of silent men who spoke to horses, of auctions where souls were sold instead of bodies. She woke once to find moonlight streaming through the window, painting silver rectangles on the floor. The house had settled into its nighttime rhythm of creaks and sighs, and somewhere in the distance, she could swear she heard the lonely melody of a harmonica playing a tune she almost recognized. Morning would bring the preacher, the marriage, the beginning of whatever strange partnership she'd entered into with Cassidy Blackwood. But tonight, she was suspended between her old life and the new, neither maiden nor wife, neither free nor bound. It was a peculiar kind of freedom, she realized, the freedom of the space between one story's end and another's beginning. She pulled the quilt up to her chin and closed her eyes again. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. Tonight, for the first time in months, she felt something that might have been peace. Or, if not peace, at least the absence of immediate fear. In a frontier where women had few choices and fewer protections, that was perhaps enough. The house at Widow's Bluff kept its secrets close, but it had accepted her presence without protest, and in the barn, a broken man played his harmonica to the horses while the stars wheeled overhead. Marking time until dawn would force them both to face what came next. The preacher pronounced them man and wife at sunrise, his words echoing off the walls of Willow Creek's tiny chapel. Reverend Marcus Hayes was a traveling minister who'd seen enough frontier marriages to know when not to ask questions. He'd noted Eloise's Eastern bearing and Cass's haunted eyes, pocketed his fee, and wished them God's blessings with genuine warmth. Now, 3 weeks later, those blessings seemed to have manifested in the smallest ways, in the rhythm of shared silence, in the careful dance of two people learning to exist in the same space without collision. Eloise woke each morning to find fresh water already drawn from the creek, the stove fire banked but ready to be stirred to life. Cass rose before dawn, moving through his chores with the quiet efficiency of long practice. By the time she emerged from the bedroom, he still slept in the barn. Despite her protests, he'd be gone, checking fence lines or tending the small herd of cattle that grazed in the valley below. Their days fell into a pattern unmarked by words but rich with small gestures. She would prepare breakfast, leaving his portion covered on the stove. He would eat after she'd retreated to the garden, always washing his own dishes, always leaving a small token of appreciation, a handful of wild berries, a pretty stone, once a tail feather from a red-tailed hawk. On this particular morning, Eloise found something different on the table, a pair of leather gloves, clearly handmade, the stitching careful if not expert. She picked them up, marveling at the softness of the deer hide, the way they'd been shaped to fit smaller hands, her hands. She was still examining them when Cass entered, earlier than usual. He stopped in the doorway, hat in hand, seemingly surprised to find her there. "For the garden," he said gruffly, gesturing at the gloves. "Saw you'd torn your others on the fence wire." "You made these." She slipped one on, flexing her fingers. The fit was nearly perfect. He shrugged, a gesture she'd come to recognize as his default response to anything approaching gratitude. Had the leather, seemed wasteful not to use it. "Thank you." She wanted to say more, to acknowledge the hours he must have spent cutting and stitching by lamplight, but his discomfort with appreciation was palpable. Instead, she changed the subject. "Coffee's fresh, if you'd like some." He hesitated, then nodded, settling into what she'd come to think of as his chair, the one facing the door, back to the wall. Old habits of a man who'd learned to watch for trouble. She poured 2 cups, noting how he wrapped his hands around the tin mug as if drawing warmth from more than just the coffee. They sat in comfortable silence, the morning light slanting through the window to paint golden rectangles on the floor. "Storm coming," he said finally, gazing out at the cloudless sky. "Maybe tomorrow, maybe the day after. Can smell it on the wind." She'd learned to trust his weather predictions, born from years of reading the subtle signs of the high desert. "I'll bring in the laundry early." Then, another silence, but softer somehow. She discovered that Cass's silences had different textures, sharp when he was troubled, soft when he was at peace, heavy when the past pressed too close. This morning's quiet was companionable, almost warm. "Found something you might want," he said suddenly, rising from the table. He disappeared into the lean-to he used for storage, returning with a leather-bound book. He stopped, cleared his throat. "Was in a trunk. Thought you might use it, seeing as you write in that journal of yours." She accepted the book carefully. It was a ledger, mostly blank, the kind used for keeping household accounts. But tucked inside the front cover was a sheet of pressed flowers, lupines and Indian paintbrush, their colors still vivid despite their preservation. "It's beautiful," she said softly. "Are you sure?" "No use to me." His voice was rougher than usual. "Things shouldn't go to waste just because—" Again, that abrupt stop, as if words were a minefield he had to navigate with care. That afternoon, while Cass was out checking on a sick calf, Eloise explored more of the property, behind the house. She discovered what must have once been a proper garden, now gone wild. Traces remained of its former organization, the skeleton of a grape arbor, the outline of raised beds, a rose bush struggling against the encroaching sage. She knelt among the ruins, pulling weeds from around the rows. It was an old variety, the kind her grandmother had grown, with small but intensely fragrant blooms. A few buds clung to the thorny branches, promising beauty if given the chance. Caroline loved that rose. She startled, not having heard Cass approach. He stood a few feet away, hands in his pockets, studying the plant with an expression she couldn't read. "Your wife," she ventured, the first time either had spoken of her directly. He nodded once. "Brought it from Missouri as a cutting, wrapped in wet burlap, carried in her lap the whole way. Said every home needed at least one beautiful, impractical thing." It was the most he'd ever said about his past. Eloise continued working, sensing that movement was easier than stillness for him when memories surfaced. "She'd be glad someone was tending it again," he continued, his voice distant. "Always said gardens were proof that people believed in tomorrow." "She sounds wise." "She was." He turned abruptly and walked away, but not before she caught the glitter of moisture in his eyes. That evening, Eloise cooked the prairie hen Cass had brought home, seasoning it with wild sage and the last of her precious hoard of pepper. She set 2 places, as always, and was surprised when he appeared in the doorway at dinner time. "Smells good," he offered, taking his seat with obvious uncertainty. They ate in silence at first, but it was a different kind of quiet, expectant rather than empty. Finally. Eloise gathered her courage. "I had a garden once," she said, "in Charleston. Grew tomatoes and beans, flowers for the church altar." She rubbed her scarred wrist unconsciously. "After the incident, they said I'd corrupted it somehow. The minister's wife had the whole thing torn out and burned." Cass looked up from his plate, his gray eyes steady on hers. "People do cruel things when they're afraid." What were they afraid of? The truth, maybe, that bad things happen to good people, that they couldn't control everything with their prayers and propriety. He set down his fork. "Easier to blame you than accept that sometimes the world just breaks things." "Is that what happened to you? The world broke things?" He was quiet for so long she thought he'd retreated back into silence. Then, "No. What happened to me? I had a hand in... That's the difference." Before she could respond, he rose from the table. "Thank you for the meal." He paused at the door. "That garden out back, you could bring it back if you wanted. Seeds in the shed, tools too." After he left, Eloise sat alone at the table, processing the fragments of information he'd shared. Caroline, who believed in tomorrow, a tragedy he blamed himself for. The careful distance he maintained, not from cruelty, but from something that looked like fear. She cleared the dishes, then retrieved her journal, the new one Cass had given her. Opening it to the first page, she began to write. Asterisk, June 7th, 1879. Widow's Bluff, asterisk. Asterisk. Not every cage has locks. Some are made of silence. But I'm learning that silence itself can be a kind of communication. Today he made me gloves, shaped to fit my hands, stitched with patience I didn't know he possessed. He speaks of his dead wife in fragments, like a man parceling out pain in doses he can bear. Asterisk. We are two damaged creatures learning to exist in the same space. He brings me hawk feathers. I leave him extra coffee. He gives me a garden. I tend his roses. Neither of us speaks of love or duty or the future. We simply continue. One day, folding into the next, each small kindness building something I don't yet have a name for. That night, she heard his harmonica again, the sound drifting from the barn like smoke. The melody was different this time, less mournful, though still tinged with sadness. She recognized it finally. Shenandoah, a song about longing and rivers and the distances between hearts. Unable to sleep, she wrapped herself in a shawl and stepped onto the porch. The promised storm was building on the horizon, lightning flickering between the mountains like signal fires. The air was thick with the promise of rain, that peculiar desert perfume of dust and sage and anticipation. Storm'll break by morning. Cass's voice came from the shadows by the corral. She moved to join him, maintaining a careful distance. Together they watched the light show in the distance, the night punctuated by thunder that rolled across the valley like distant drums. "Are you ever not afraid?" she asked suddenly. He considered the question, his profile silvered by lightning flash. "Fear's just another way of being alive. The trick is not letting it be the only way." "And how do you manage that?" He turned to look at her then, and in the brief illumination of another lightning strike, she saw something in his face that might have been the beginning of a smile. "Still working on it," he admitted. "But it helps, having someone else around who understands the weight of carrying what can't be set down." The first drops of rain began to fall, large and warm and smelling of dust. Without discussion, they retreated to the porch, sitting on the rough bench Cass had built against the wall. The storm swept in with frontier violence, turning the world into a cacophony of water and wind. "Thank you," Eloise said under cover of thunder. "For the gloves, for the garden, for—" She gestured helplessly at the space between them, this strange, careful dance they were learning. "No need for thanks," he replied. "We're just two people trying to make it through. Nothing more complicated than that." But it was more complicated, and they both knew it. It was leather-shaped to fit her hands, and roses tended in another woman's memory. It was silence that spoke volumes and small kindnesses that built bridges across grief. It was learning that broken things could still be useful, still be beautiful, still be worth the careful tending that might, in time, lead to something like healing. The storm raged on, but the porch roof held, and they sat together in the darkness, not touching but somehow connected. Two souls who'd found, if not peace, then at least a quiet place to rest while the world tried to wash itself clean. The attack came just after midnight, when the moon was dark and the desert held its breath. Eloise woke to the sound of breaking glass and Cass's sharp command, "The cellar! Now!" She didn't question, didn't hesitate. Months of frontier living had taught her that survival often depended on immediate obedience to such warnings. She grabbed the rifle from beside the door. Cass had taught her to shoot. Patient afternoons spent learning to lead a target, and descended into the root cellar's musty darkness. Above, she heard boots on the porch, voices raised in anger. Not random bandits. Then, this was targeted, specific. Through the cellar's wooden slats, she could see torch flames dancing, hear the accusations. "Blackwood, we know you're harboring them Apache sympathizers. Come out and face justice like a man." Cass's voice, steady despite the danger. "Get off my land, Morrison. You've got no business here." "Our business is keeping this territory safe from savages and those who'd help them." Morrison spat. "Seen you leaving water out by Eagle Rock. Seen them tracks." Eloise pressed her eye to a gap in the floorboards. She could make out 4 men, maybe 5, all armed. Morrison, the ringleader. She recognized from town, a man who wore his hatred like a badge of honor. "I leave water for my cattle," Cass replied evenly. "Crime to water stock on my own land now. Don't play games with us, Blackwood. We know what you done, what you was." A silence stretched taut as wire. When Cass spoke again, his voice had changed, carrying an authority Eloise had never heard before. "I know exactly what I was. Morrison, question is, do you want to wake those ghosts? You'd better be prepared for what rises." Through her limited view, Eloise saw movement in the shadows beyond the torchlight. Her heart stopped as she recognized the small figure creeping closer. A child, Apache by his dress. Couldn't be more than 10 or 11 years old. He was trying to reach the water barrel Cass kept filled by the corner of the house. One of Morrison's men spotted him at the same moment. "There, told you he was hiding them." The man raised his rifle, and time seemed to slow. Eloise watched in horror as the barrel swung toward the boy, who'd frozen like a rabbit before wolves. She waited for the shot, for Cass to act, for something. But Cass didn't move, didn't raise his own weapon, didn't shout a warning. He stood perfectly still as the man's finger tightened on the trigger. "No!" The word tore from Eloise's throat as she burst from the cellar, her rifle raised. "You won't harm a child." The distraction was enough. The boy darted into the darkness as Morrison's man swung toward this new threat. But Cass was already moving, placing himself between Eloise and the guns with fluid grace. "My wife's touched in the head," he said calmly. "Women's hysteria. You know how it is." Morrison studied them both with narrowed eyes. "Your wife, is she the bought bride from the auction?" "Legal and binding," Cass confirmed. "Now get off my land before I forget my Christian charity." The standoff stretched eternal, broken only when Morrison spat tobacco juice dangerously close to Cass's boots. "This ain't over, Blackwood. You've chosen your side. Best remember that when the reckoning comes." They left slowly, making a show of their reluctance. But they left. Eloise remained rigid until the sound of hoofbeats faded into the distance. Only then did she realize she was shaking. "Get inside," Cass ordered. His voice clipped. He scanned the darkness, then followed her in, barring the door behind them. "That boy is gone. Safe," he set his rifle on the table with careful control. "What were you thinking?" coming out like that. They were going to shoot a child. And now they know you'll defend Apache children. You've painted a target on your back. While you just stood there, the accusation burst out before she could stop it. You would have let them... Yes. The single word fell between them like a stone. He sank into a chair, suddenly looking every one of his years. Yes, I would have stood there, because I've seen what happens when I don't. The lamp flame flickered, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Outside, a coyote howled, long and mournful. Tell me, Eloise said softly, settling into the chair across from him. Tell me what happened. He stared at his hands for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was distant, as if relating events that had happened to someone else. I was Captain Cassidy Blackwood, 7th Cavalry. Young, ambitious, believed in manifest destiny and all that righteous nonsense. His laugh was bitter. Got orders to clear out a Chiricahua village. Intelligence said they were harboring hostiles, planning raids, winter of '74. Eloise waited, patient as she'd learned to be with him. Village was mostly women, children, elderly. The warriors were gone. Hunting. Didn't matter to my superiors. Orders were orders. His hands clenched and unclenched. I should have refused. Should have done 100 things different. Instead, I followed protocol. Had my men surround the village at dawn. Gave them one warning to surrender. They couldn't. Could they not without their men? They tried to run. His voice dropped to barely above a whisper. Standard procedure was to prevent escape. I gave the order to burn the shelters, drive them out into the open for capture. The lamplight caught the moisture in his eyes, the deep lines carved by guilt and grief. Wind changed. Fire spread faster than anyone expected. The smoke, the screaming. He pressed his palms against his eyes. 23 dead, mostly children, burned or trampled in the panic. Oh, Cass. Eloise reached across the table, but he pulled back. That's not the worst of it. The warriors returned during the chaos. Saw what we'd done. They knew they couldn't win against our numbers. So they waited. Tracked us. Learned our patterns. His voice went flat. Emotionless. 3 months later, they came to Fort Buchanan while most of the garrison was on patrol. Came for vengeance. Caroline, Eloise breathed. Caroline, our daughter, Mary, she was 3. The words came harder now, dragged from some deep place. Same tactic. Fire at dawn. I was away, chasing ghosts in the desert. By the time I got back, he stood abruptly, pacing to the window. 23 for 23. They were precise in their justice. Left a painted stone for each life taken. So I'd know. So I'd understand this was payment for my sins. That's why you didn't shoot tonight. Why you couldn't... Every time I raise a weapon against them, I see Mary's face. See Caroline trying to get her out of the burning quarters. He turned to face her, and the raw pain in his eyes was terrible to witness. So, yes, I leave water, food sometimes, let them pass through my land unmolested. And yes, I would have let that boy run rather than raise a hand to stop him. Because I've paid enough prices, extracted enough costs. The ledger's balanced in blood, and I won't add to either side of it. Eloise rose slowly, approaching him as she might a wounded animal. This time, when she reached out, he didn't pull away. Her hand found his, calloused and scarred, and held tight. You're not that man anymore. Aren't I? I still wear his face, still carry his name. Names can be changed, faces age. But the man who makes gloves for his wife's torn hands, who tends a rose bush in memory of love, who offers water to any who thirst, that's not the same man who followed orders into damnation. He looked at their joined hands with wonder, as if surprised to find connection still possible. Morrison won't let this go, he said finally. He'll be back, with more men. Then we'll face them, together. You don't understand what you're risking. Don't I? She pulled back her sleeve, revealing the long scar in the lamplight. Charleston society wanted me to die for my shame, called it justice, but I chose to live instead, to run, to find whatever peace I could steal from a world that had already condemned me. She met his eyes steadily. I understand risking everything for the chance to be more than your worst moment. That's what you gave me when you raised your hand at that auction. Let me give it back to you now. He studied her face for a long moment, then pulled her into his arms. It was the first time they'd embraced, and she could feel him trembling, whether from exhaustion or emotion. She couldn't tell, perhaps both. I thought I had nothing left to protect, he murmured into her hair. But now, I don't want to be punished anymore. Then stop punishing yourself. Stop living like a ghost in your own life. They stood together as the lamp burned low. Two damaged souls learning that confession could be its own kind of absolution. Outside, the desert night continued its ancient rhythms, indifferent to human grief and human hope alike. When they finally parted, Cass touched her face with infinite gentleness. You're braver than I am. Eloise Blackwood. No, she corrected softly. Just broken in different places. But maybe that's enough. Two broken people, choosing to heal in parallel, if not quite together. He nodded slowly, understanding glimmering in his storm-gray eyes. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Morrison's return, the weight of choices that couldn't be unmade. But tonight, in the flickering lamplight of a frontier cabin, two souls had found something precious in their mutual ruins, the possibility of forgiveness, not from God or society, but from the only judges who truly mattered, themselves. The letter lay on the kitchen table like an accusation, its edges charred and curling. Eloise had found it purely by accident while cleaning out the old stove, tucked behind a loose brick where it had escaped the flames that claimed its companions. The ink was faded but legible. Cass's careful script addressing words to ghosts. Asterisk. My dearest Caroline, today Mary would have been 7. I imagine her with your eyes, your laugh, your way of finding joy in smallest things. I write these letters knowing they'll never reach you, but the alternative is accepting you're truly gone, and I asterisk. You had no right. Eloise spun to find Cass in the doorway, his face carved from granite. She'd been so absorbed in the letter she hadn't heard him return from the morning's work. I was cleaning. It fell out. You had no right. The words erupted from him with volcanic force. He crossed the room in 2 strides, snatching the letter from her hands. This is mine. Mine! You don't get to touch that part of me. Cass, I didn't mean... But he was already at the stove, feeding the letter to the flames with shaking hands. The paper curled and blackened, taking his words to ash. When he turned back to her, his eyes were wild with a pain she'd never seen so naked. 4 years. 4 years I've written to them. And you... He stopped, chest heaving. You think because we share a house, share a name, you have claim to everything. Some doors stay closed. Eloise, some ghosts don't get disturbed. You're right, she said quietly, though anger was building in her chest. I shouldn't have read it. But Cass, you can't keep living like this. Like what? Like you're still buried with them. The words burst out before she could stop them. You sleep in the barn like a penitent. You write letters to the dead. You've turned this house into a tomb and yourself into its guardian. You say you want to stop being punished, but you're still holding the whip. His face went white. You don't understand. Don't I? You think you're the only one who's lost everything? She yanked up her sleeve, displaying her scar in the lamplight. This was my attempt to join my own ghosts. The scandal, the shame. Watching everything I'd built crumble because I dared to refuse a man who thought he owned me. But I chose to live. Cass, messy and imperfect and hard as it is, I chose to live. You're still choosing to die. Just slowly. Get out! His voice was deadly quiet. Get out. She fled then, but not to the desert. She went to the garden, attacking the weeds with a fury that matched the storm in her heart. How dare he? How dare he offer her glimpses of the man he could be? Gentle, considerate, capable of tenderness, only to slam the door when she tried to help him step fully into the light. The sun climbed higher, beating down mercilessly. She worked until her hands blistered inside the gloves he'd made, until her dress was soaked with sweat, until the anger burned itself down to hurt. When she finally stopped, the rose bush stood clear of weeds, its few blooms nodding in the slight breeze. Cass hadn't returned for the midday meal. His absence sat heavy as a presence, filling the house with unspoken words. Eloise prepared food anyway. Habit, hope, or stubbornness. She couldn't say which. The plate sat untouched as afternoon melted into evening. She found herself at the table as darkness fell. Journal opened before her, but for once words wouldn't come. How could she capture this particular ache, this sensation of reaching for something vital, only to have it turn to smoke in her hands? Instead, she found herself sketching the rose bush, the mountains beyond. Cass's hands as she remembered them shaping leather into gloves. She wasn't much of an artist, but the act of creation soothed something raw in her chest. The front door opened near midnight. She didn't look up from her drawing, though every nerve was aware of his presence. He moved through the room quietly, and she expected him to leave again. Instead, she heard the scrape of a chair. "I burned them all," he said to the darkness between them. "Every letter, every word, 3 years' worth, gone in minutes." A pause. "All but that one. Couldn't bring myself to burn the last piece of her handwriting." Eloise set down her pencil but remained silent. "You're right," he continued, voice rough. "I've been walking around with one foot in the grave so long I forgot what solid ground felt like. Caroline would have—" He laughed, short and bitter. "She would have taken a switch to me for wasting so much time." "She sounds formidable." "She was tiny thing, barely came up to my shoulder, but she could stare down a cavalry charge." His voice warmed with memory. "First time I saw her, she was facing down 3 drunk soldiers who were harassing a Mexican family. Had nothing but a parasol and righteous fury. But they backed down." "You loved her very much." I do. That's the problem." He shifted in his chair, leather creaking. "How do you move forward when moving forward feels like betrayal? How do you let yourself feel anything new when feeling means risking that pain again?" Their eyes met across the table, understanding arcing between them like lightning. "I wrote that letter after you wore the gloves I made," he admitted. "Felt something I hadn't felt in so long I'd forgotten its name. Hope, maybe, or just possibility. And it terrified me so much I had to write to her. To confess I was beginning to—" He stopped. "To what?" "To see you, not just as someone sharing my space, but as Eloise, as yourself." He rubbed his face with both hands. "Then finding you with the letter, it felt like worlds colliding, like I was betraying both of you somehow." Eloise reached across the table, not quite touching his hand, but letting hers rest nearby. "The dead don't need our loyalty. Cass, they need our remembrance. Yes, but not our endless penance. Caroline loved you. Would she want this half-life for you?" "No." The word was barely a whisper. "She'd call me 7 kinds of fool and probably worse. Then perhaps it's time to listen to her." He turned his hand palm up on the table. An invitation. She accepted, interlacing their fingers carefully, as if weaving something fragile but necessary. "I can't promise to stop grieving," he said. "Can't promise the ghosts won't win some days. I'm not asking for promises, just presence. Be here in this life, instead of always standing watch at a grave." He squeezed her hand gently. "That why you were attacking the garden like it personally offended you?" Despite everything, she smiled. The weeds had it coming. "I'm sorry," he said simply. "For the anger, for the months of distance, for being too scared to want something good. I'm sorry too, for reading what wasn't meant for me, for pushing when you needed space. They sat in the quiet kitchen, hands linked across the scarred wooden table. Outside, an owl called, its voice threading through the darkness like a question. "I don't know how to do this," Cass admitted. "How to be whatever we're becoming." "Neither do I, but maybe that's all right. Maybe we just take it one day at a time, like tending a garden, water, sunlight, patience, and pulling weeds when necessary. Especially then." He stood, still holding her hand, and drew her to her feet. For a moment they stood close, the air between them charged with possibility. Then, carefully, as if she might break or vanish, he pulled her into an embrace. This time she could feel not just sorrow in his hold, but something else, a tentative warmth, like the first green shoots after a hard winter. She wrapped her arms around him in return, offering her own warmth to the thaw. "Stay," she whispered against his shoulder. "Not in the barn, not in the past. Here." He pulled back enough to see her face, searching her eyes for something. Permission, perhaps, or absolution. Whatever he found there seemed to settle something in him. "All right," he said simply. They prepared for bed with careful courtesy, aware of the shift in the air between them. When she emerged from behind the changing screen, he was sitting on the edge of the bed, looking lost. "I haven't," he began, then stopped. "Not since—" "I know." She settled beside him, taking his hand again. "We don't have to be anything but present. That's enough for now." He nodded, visibly relieved. They lay down side by side, carefully not touching, both staring at the ceiling. The house settled around them with familiar creaks and sighs. "Eloise," his voice came soft in the darkness. "Yes, thank you for seeing someone worth saving in all this wreckage." She turned on her side, finding his profile in the moonlight. "Thank you for being brave enough to be seen." He turned to face her then, and they lay there, inches and lifetimes apart, learning the shape of possibility. Outside, the desert night sang its ancient songs, and inside, two wounded hearts began the careful work of building something new from the ashes of what had been. The last letter was gone, burned to nothing like all the rest, but in its place, something else was beginning to be written. Not in ink on paper, but in small gestures and growing trust, in the space between one heartbeat and the next, where hope lives despite all reason to the contrary. The morning started like any other, with Eloise heading to the creek for water while Cass tended the horses. The sun painted the desert in shades of gold and amber, and a hawk circled lazily overhead. She hummed as she walked, a hymn from childhood that had somehow survived all the miles and years between Charleston and here. The first sign of trouble was the silence. No birds, no insects. Even the ever-present wind had stilled. The second was the rope that snaked around her waist, yanking her off her feet before she could scream. Well, Blackwood's woman, all alone. She recognized the voice. Jake Morrison's younger brother, Samuel. As rough hands hauled her upright, she counted 3 men, all armed, all bearing the particular combination of righteousness and cruelty that marked Morrison's followers. "My husband will—" "Your husband's checking the north pasture. Won't be back for hours." Samuel's grin was predatory. Plenty of time to teach him a lesson about harboring savages and their sympathizers. They bound her hands, threw her across a saddle like a sack of grain. Every bounce sent pain shooting through her ribs, but she forced herself to stay silent, to think. Cass had taught her to track, to notice details, the sun's position, the shape of the mountains, the direction they rode. All of it she filed away. They stopped at an abandoned miner's shack several miles into the hills. The structure leaned drunkenly, its wooden walls bleached gray by decades of desert sun. Inside, it smelled of pack rats and old violence. "Tie her to the post," Samuel ordered. "Morrison wants to be here for the questioning." Questioning. One of the others, a nervous boy who couldn't be more than 17, shifted uncomfortably. Sam, she's just a woman. A woman who defended Apache brats. Who knows what else she and Blackwood have been up to? Samuel's eyes glittered with fervor. Times like these, everyone's got to choose a side. She chose wrong. They left the nervous boy to guard her while they waited for Morrison. Eloise tested her bonds. Tight, but the post was old, weathered. She might be able to work it loose given time. "I'm sorry about this, ma'am," the boy said quietly once the others were outside. "It ain't right, but Morrison, he says—" "What's your name?" Eloise kept her voice gentle despite her racing heart. Thomas Garrett." "You have family, Thomas." "My ma, back in Tucson, she don't know I'm riding with Morrison." "Would she be proud of you kidnapping women?" He flushed, looking away. "Morrison says we're protecting the territory. Says sometimes hard choices." "There's nothing hard about this choice. Thomas, you know this is wrong." The hours crawled by. Eloise worked at her bonds whenever Thomas wasn't looking, feeling the rough rope tear at her wrists. Blood made them slippery, which helped just a little more. Hoofbeats announced Morrison's arrival. He entered the shack like he owned it, hat tilted at an arrogant angle, hand resting on his pistol. "Mrs. Blackwood, or should I say, Miss Whitfield never can tell with auction brides if the marriage is legitimate." "It's legal and binding, as you well know." "Maybe so, but harboring enemies of the territory, that's a hanging offense." He pulled up a broken crate, sitting close enough that she could smell the whiskey on his breath. "Where does your husband hide them, the Apache raiders?" "There are no raiders, only desperate people trying to survive." His backhand snapped her head to the side, filling her mouth with a copper taste of blood. "Wrong answer. Let's try again." The questioning continued as the sun tracked across the sky. Morrison alternated between violence and false kindness, trying to break her. But Eloise had survived Charleston society's attempts to destroy her. She could survive this too. It was nearly dusk when she heard it. The distinctive cry of a hawk, but slightly off, not quite natural. Hope flared in her chest. Morrison heard it too. "Check outside," he barked at Samuel. The younger Morrison had barely reached the door when it exploded inward. Cass stood silhouetted against the dying light, terrible in his calm. His guns remained holstered, but his very stillness radiated threat. "Let her go, Morrison." "Blackwood." Morrison drew his pistol, pressing it against Eloise's temple. "Right on time. Come to watch your woman pay for your sins." "My sins are my own. She has no part in them." "Doesn't she defending those savage brats? You've corrupted her with your Indian-loving ways." Cass took a step forward. Morrison cocked the hammer. "Ah, another step and I decorate this shack with her brains." "Then you'll die a heartbeat later." "Maybe so, but she'll still be dead." Morrison's grin was feral. "Unless you confess, tell everyone what you really did out here. Why you really protect them savages." "I was a soldier. I followed orders. Innocents died." Cass's voice was steady as stone. "That what you want to hear?" "The whole truth, Blackwood. Tell them about Fort Buchanan, about how your Apache friends knew exactly when to strike, exactly where the women and children would be, almost like someone told them." Eloise felt Cass go rigid. This was new, an accusation she hadn't heard before. "That's a lie." "Is it? You were awful quick to resign your commission after... awful quick to disappear out here where you could play protector to the very savages who killed your family." Morrison's voice dripped poison. "Makes a man wonder." "I wasn't there. I couldn't save them." "Because you were conveniently leading patrols the wrong direction." "How much did they pay you?" "Blackwood, what was the price for your own family's lives?" "Enough!" The roar came not from Cass but from Eloise. In the moment of distraction, she wrenched sideways, the weakened post finally giving way. Morrison's shot went wide, and then Cass was on him, the two men crashing into the shack's wall. Samuel raised his rifle, but Thomas grabbed the barrel. "No, this ain't right." The fight was brutal, efficient. Morrison was younger, but Cass fought with the desperate strength of a man with everything to lose. They rolled across the floor, punches landing with sickening thuds. Morrison pulled a knife. Cass caught his wrist, the blade trembling inches from his throat. With a final surge of strength, Cass twisted, and the knife plunged into Morrison's shoulder instead of its intended target. Morrison screamed, dropping his weapons. Cass stood slowly, breathing hard, blood dripping from a dozen cuts. "Get him out of here," he told Samuel, who looked too shocked to argue. "Get him patched up and get gone. Any of you come near my wife again, I won't show mercy." They dragged Morrison out, his curses echoing off the hills. Thomas lingered at the door. "I'm sorry," he said to Eloise. "My ma, you were right. She wouldn't be proud." After they'd gone, Cass cut Eloise's bonds with shaking hands. Her wrists were raw and bleeding, her face swollen from Morrison's interrogation, but she was alive. "How did you find me?" "Saw your tracks at the creek. The struggle. Followed." He cupped her face gently, examining her injuries. "I'm sorry. This is my fault." "No, Morrison's hatred is his own." She caught his hands. "What he said about Fort Buchanan was a lie meant to wound." But his eyes slid away from hers. "Cass." He sank onto the broken crate, suddenly looking ancient. "I've carried suspicions. The attack was too perfect, too precise. Someone might have provided information. But I swear to you, Eloise, on Caroline's grave and Mary's memory, it wasn't me." "I know." She knelt before him, taking his bloodied hands in her damaged ones. "I know who you are. Cassidy Blackwood. You're a man who carries too much guilt for sins both real and imagined. But you're not a traitor. You loved them. Love wasn't enough to save them. Love is never enough to save anyone, but it's enough to honor them, to choose to be better." She pressed her forehead against their joined hands. "To choose to live." He pulled her up and into his arms, holding her as if she might shatter or vanish. She could feel him trembling, reaction, relief, or something deeper. "I thought I'd lost you," he whispered, "when I saw your tracks. The blood. I thought—" His voice broke. "I can't do it again. Eloise, I can't lose." "You won't." She pulled back to meet his eyes. "I'm tougher than I look. Charleston Belle. Remember, we're trained to survive ballrooms and backstabbing. A few territorial thugs are nothing compared to a church social." "Despite everything," he laughed, a rusty sound, but real. "You're extraordinary." "I'm stubborn. There's a difference." They helped each other outside, where Cass's horse waited patiently. The ride home was slow. Eloise seated in front of him, his arms careful around her battered ribs. Stars began to emerge, mapping the sky in ancient patterns. "Morrison won't stop," Cass said quietly. "This will escalate. Then we'll face it. Together." She leaned back against his chest, feeling his heartbeat steady against her spine. "No more running, no more hiding. Whatever comes, we meet it head on." His arms tightened fractionally. "When did you become the brave one?" "The day a broken cowboy raised his hand at an auction," she said simply. "Everything since has been learning to live up to that moment of grace." They rode on through the desert night, two souls scarred by different battles, but united in their determination to defend the life they were building. Behind them, blood soaked into the dust of the abandoned shack. Ahead, the lights of home beckoned through the darkness. Not a promise of safety, but of something more valuable, a place to make their stand. Together, against whatever storms might come. Winter came early to Widow's Bluff that year, bringing with it a cold that seemed to seep into the very bones of the house. Cass's recovery from the fight with Morrison was slow, complicated by infection that left him fevered and delirious for days. Eloise tended him with the same quiet determination she brought to everything. But fear was a constant companion as she watched him battle demons both physical and remembered. "Caroline, no, the fire. I can't reach." She bathed his burning forehead with cool water, murmuring soothing nonsense as he thrashed in the grip of memory. These were the worst moments, when the fever stripped away his careful control and left only raw grief. "I'm here," she whispered, holding his hand through the worst of it. "You're safe. I'm here." On the fourth night, his fever finally broke. He woke to find her slumped in the chair beside the bed, still holding his hand, the journal he'd given her open on her lap. By lamplight, he could make out her latest entry. Asterisk, I am learning that love is not always grand gestures or passionate declarations. Sometimes it is simply staying. It is cool water on fevered skin, soup coaxed between reluctant lips, maintaining vigil when darkness presses close. C speaks to his ghosts in fever dreams, and I finally understand. He has been trying to save them every night for 5 years, and failing. No wonder he chose isolation. No wonder he fears connection. To love is to risk losing, and he has lost so much already. "You shouldn't have to read that," Eloise said softly, realizing he was awake. Truth shouldn't need hiding. His voice was rough but clear. "How long?" 4 days. The wound went septic. Doc Perkins said. She stopped, unable to voice how close it had been. He squeezed her hand weakly. "But you stayed. Where else would I go? This is home." The simple declaration seemed to break something loose in him. "I need to tell you something. About the letters." "You don't have to." "I do." He struggled to sit up, and she helped him, propping pillows behind his back. "I wrote to them, yes, but also I wrote to you, before I knew you. The woman I imagined might someday—" He stopped, gathering strength. "In my mind, she was nothing like Caroline. Different entirely. Dark-haired where Caroline was fair. Quiet where she was boisterous. Someone who might understand shadows because she'd walked through her own." Eloise's breath caught. "Cass." "When I saw you on that platform, defiant despite everything, I thought I was losing my mind. You were her, the woman from the letters I never sent." He met her eyes, his own clearer than she'd seen them in months. "Maybe that's why I raised my hand. Not to save you, but because I'd been waiting for you without knowing it." She leaned forward, pressing her forehead to his. "We've been saving each other from the very beginning." His recovery progressed slowly but steadily. Eloise read to him from her journal, sharing observations about ranch life, the garden's progress, the personalities of various chickens. He taught her to read weather signs, to mend tack, to understand the subtle communications between horses. They were building something together, not just a marriage, but a partnership. One afternoon, as snow began to dust the mountains, Cass presented her with something wrapped in oilcloth. "Early Christmas gift," he said gruffly. Inside was a leather-bound book, newer than the journal, with her initials tooled into the cover, E.B., Eloise Blackwood. "It's beautiful," she breathed. "Open it." The first page held his careful script. Asterisk for Eloise, who teaches by example that the past need not define the future, who brings life to gardens and houses and hearts long thought barren. With gratitude and growing affection. "See, Cass, Words failed her. "There's more." She turned the page to find a letter, dated recently. Asterisk, Dear Eloise. Asterisk, I write not to ghosts, but to the living woman who shares my days. You asked once why I raised my hand at that auction. The truth is simpler and more complex than I could articulate then. I saw in you what I had lost in myself, the will to continue despite all reasons to quit. Asterisk, these months with you have taught me that grief need not be a locked room where I serve a life sentence. It can be a room I visit, honor what resides there, then close the door and return to the business of living. You have shown me that love is not betrayal of the past, but honoring of the present. Asterisk, I am not an eloquent man. Words come hard. especially ones that matter. But know this, you are no longer here because I bought your contract. You are here because I cannot imagine this house, this life, without you in it. You have taken a place meant for surviving and transformed it into a home. Asterisk, I am, with growing certainty, your husband, Cassidy asterisk. Tears blurred her vision as she finished reading. When she looked up, he was watching her with that mixture of hope and fear she'd come to recognize. I love you too, she said simply. His exhale was shaky. You're sure I'm not whole, Eloise. Parts of me died in that fire, and they're not coming back. I'm not asking for whole, I'm asking for real, for present. She moved to sit beside him on the bed, curling into his side carefully. We're both carrying pieces of who we used to be, but maybe that's all right. Maybe broken people can build something beautiful from the fragments. He pressed his lips to her hair. When did you become so wise? Somewhere between learning to shoot and learning to trust, you're a good teacher. They sat in comfortable silence, watching snow begin to fall beyond the window. The flakes were large and lazy, transforming the harsh landscape into something softer. I've been thinking, Cass said eventually, about what comes next. Morrison's not done with us. This fight isn't over. I know, but I'm tired of just defending, of waiting for the next attack. He shifted to look at her directly. What if we went on the offensive, not with violence, but with truth? The territorial governor's been making noise about investigating the vigilante groups. What if we gave testimony official record about what Morrison and his ilk have been doing? Eloise considered this. It would paint an even bigger target on us. Yes, but it might also protect others. That Apache boy, others like him, families just trying to survive. His jaw set with determination. I've hidden behind my guilt long enough. Time to use what authority I have left for something worthwhile. Together? She reminded him. Whatever we do together. Together, he agreed, sealing the promise with a kiss that was tender and fierce and full of hard-won hope. That evening, as Eloise prepared dinner with Cass keeping her company from his chair by the fire, she felt a shift in the air between them. The careful distance they'd maintained for months had dissolved, replaced by something warm and real and infinitely precious. Read me what you wrote today, he requested, gesturing at her journal. She retrieved it, settling into her own chair. It's not much. Please. She opened to the latest entry. Asterisk, December 20th, 1879. Widow's Bluff asterisk. Asterisk snow transforms everything, making even the familiar strange and beautiful. C is recovering well, though he chafes at confinement like a wolf in a cage. I catch him watching me sometimes with an expression I can only call wonder, as if I am some impossible gift he's afraid will vanish. I want to tell him I feel the same, that finding love in this unlikely place, with this unlikely man, feels like the kind of miracle I stopped believing in long ago. Asterisk. We do not speak of the future beyond tomorrow, but there is future in our planning. Seeds ordered for spring. Talk of expanding the chicken coop. Small dreams, perhaps, but dreams nonetheless. After so long living day to day, the very act of anticipating seasons to come feels revolutionary. Asterisk, I am learning that resurrection is not a single moment, but a process. We die to our old selves by degrees, and by degrees we rise into something new. C and I are midwifing each other into whatever comes next, and if that is not love, I do not know what is. She looked up to find him smiling, a real smile that reached his eyes and transformed his face. What? She asked, suddenly self-conscious. Just thinking Caroline would have liked you, would have grabbed you by both hands and declared you sisters within minutes of meeting. It was the first time he'd spoken of his late wife with joy rather than pain. Eloise felt the significance of the moment, the small victory it represented. I would have been honored to know her. She had this way of seeing the best in people, of believing they could rise to match her vision. You have that too. He reached for her hand. Must be why I recognize it, why it feels like coming home. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the desert in temporary peace. Inside, two people who'd found each other at the intersection of grief and hope continued the slow work of healing, one shared moment at a time. They were no longer writer and subject, purchased bride and broken buyer. They were simply Eloise and Cass, building something worth defending from the ashes of who they used to be. Spring arrived with unexpected visitors. Eloise was hanging laundry when she spotted the approaching carriage, too fine for these parts, with matched grays that belonged on eastern boulevards, not desert trails. Her heart sank as she recognized the aristocratic figure stepping down. Eloise, Margaret Whitfield, her mother's sister, stood like an accusation in black bombazine despite the warming weather. "We need to talk." Behind her, a younger man emerged, Cousin Theodore, who'd inherited what remained of the Whitfield shipping interests. His presence here meant only one thing: they'd come to reclaim what they saw as family property. Aunt Margaret. Eloise smoothed her patched calico dress, acutely aware of how she must look, sun-browned, work-worn. Nothing like the Charleston belle they remembered. "This is unexpected." Indeed, as unexpected as learning my niece had sold herself at some frontier auction like common livestock. Margaret's voice dripped disdain. "We've come to correct this situation." Casser emerged from the barn, taking in the scene with quick assessment. He moved to Eloise's side, solid and reassuring. "Ma'am, sir." He touched his hat brim. "Cass Blackwood, Eloise's husband." Theodore barely concealed his sneer. "Yes, the purchased husband. We're prepared to reimburse you, Mr. Blackwood, double what you paid, as compensation for your inconvenience." "I'm not for sale," Eloise said quietly. "Neither is our marriage." "Don't be ridiculous." Margaret's fan snapped open despite the mild temperature. "You're coming home where you belong. The scandal has died down. With proper management, we can still salvage your reputation. The Pemberton boy has agreed to consider—" "No!" The word came out stronger than Eloise intended. "I was bought once. I won't be bought again. I'm someone who chose to stay." "Choose," Theodore laughed. "What choice does a ruined woman have you should be grateful we're offering?" "The lady said no." Cass's voice carried the quiet authority that had once commanded cavalry. "I think it's time you left." Margaret's face flushed. "You dare! Do you know who we are, the Whitfield name?" "Means nothing here," Eloise interrupted. "This is my home, my life, my choice." "You always were ungrateful." Margaret's mask of civility cracked. "After everything the family did for you, taking you in after your parents' shameful deaths, trying to mold you into something respectable despite your low breeding." "That's enough." Cass stepped forward. "Whatever poison you're selling, we're not buying. Get off our land." Theodore reached into his coat. "Perhaps this will change your mind. Documentation of Mr. Blackwood's colorful past. His involvement in the Fort Buchanan massacre. His questionable discharge. I'm sure the territorial newspapers would find it fascinating." Eloise felt Cass tense beside her. The threat hung in the air like smoke. "Publish what you like," she said, surprising everyone, including herself. "Yes, my husband was a soldier who followed terrible orders. Yes, he's lived with the consequences. But he's also the man who leaves water for travelers, who teaches children to read regardless of their skin color, who saved my life more than once." She lifted her chin. "I know exactly who I married. Do you know who you are?" "Theodore, a man who'd blackmail others for refusing your money." "You've gone native." Margaret's disgust was palpable. "Living like this, defending a killer. A killer who raised his hand at an auction to save a woman from worse fates." Eloise shot back. "Who gave me freedom instead of ownership. who taught me that survival isn't shameful, that broken doesn't mean worthless. She felt tears threaten but refused to let them fall. You want to know what's shameful coming here with your money and threats, thinking you can buy me back like a strayed horse? The offer stands, Theodore said coldly. When you come to your senses, when this charade falls apart. It won't, Cass spoke quietly but with certainty. See, you're operating under a misunderstanding. This isn't a business arrangement anymore. Hasn't been for some time. He reached into his pocket, drawing out something that caught the light. A simple gold band, worn but gleaming. Eloise Blackwood, he said, turning to face her fully. I bought your contract with silver, but I'm asking for your hand with gold. Not the auction's choice, but ours. Will you marry me again properly this time? The world seemed to stop. Margaret sputtered. Theodore cursed, but Eloise saw only Cass, offering not just a ring but a declaration that what they'd built was worth defending, worth choosing, worth claiming before witnesses who'd tried to deny it. It's not fancy, he continued, his voice rough with emotion. Made it from coins I've saved, melted down and hammered out. It's not gold, but it's strong, like you, like us. Yes, she whispered, then louder. Yes, Cassidy Blackwood, I choose you. I choose this life. I choose us. He slipped the ring onto her finger, beside the simple band from their first ceremony. It fit perfectly, warm from his pocket, carrying the weight of intention. This is disgusting, Margaret hissed. You're throwing away everything. No, Eloise corrected, turning to face her aunt with new steel in her spine. I'm claiming everything. Love, home, purpose, things your money could never buy. Theodore tossed a card onto the ground. When you're starving in this wasteland, when he shows his true nature, remember we tried to save you. They left in a cloud of dust and indignation. Eloise and Cass stood together, watching the carriage disappear over the ridge. They'll make trouble, Cass warned. Those threats about the newspapers, let them. She turned in his arms, marveling at the ring on her finger. We've survived worse than gossip. That was some proposal, she added, a laugh bubbling up. In front of my horrible relatives. Seemed appropriate. They came to buy you back. Wanted them to know you can't purchase what's freely given. He cupped her face gently. I should have done this months ago. Should have made it clear that you're not here because of that auction, but because we chose each other, she finished. Every day, in small ways. The ring just makes it visible. That evening, they stood before Reverend Hayes again, this time with full hearts rather than uncertainty. The ceremony was simple, witnessed by Doc Perkins and his wife, who'd become friends rather than mere neighbors. Do you, Eloise, take this man by choice, in full knowledge of who he is and who he's becoming? I do. And do you, Cassidy, promise to honor this woman as a partner, not possession, as long as you both shall live? I do. Then by the power vested in me and the grace of God, I pronounce you husband and wife, again. And may I say, it's good to see you both choosing joy. They celebrated quietly at home, sharing a meal and dreams for the future. The garden would expand. The house would echo with more than silence. Perhaps someday, with children's laughter. They would testify against Morrison's vigilantes. They would build bridges between communities. They would live. No more letters to ghosts, Cass promised as they sat on the porch, watching stars emerge. Only to the living. No more running from the past, Eloise agreed. Only toward the future. Together. Together. The ring on her finger caught starlight. This simple band forged from saved coins and patient hope. It wasn't gold, but it was honest. It wasn't fancy, but it was theirs. Like their love, built not from perfection but from the courage to continue, to choose each other again and again, to create beauty from the ashes of who they used to be. In the distance, A coyote sang to the moon. The desert wind carried the scent of sage and possibility, and in a house that had once held only ghosts, two hearts beat in rhythm, writing a new story with each breath, each touch, each quiet moment of grace. The Whitfield carriage was gone, taking with it the last claims of a life Eloise no longer wanted. In its place remained truth. She was exactly where she belonged, with exactly who she was meant to find. Not because of an auction or a transaction, but because sometimes the broken places are where the light gets in, where love takes root, where home begins. The stars wheeled overhead, ancient and eternal, blessing the small human drama below. And somewhere in the great tapestry of the universe, two souls who'd found each other against all odds settled into sleep, ready to face tomorrow's challenges with the unshakable certainty that they would face them together. Love had not erased their scars or resurrected their dead, but it had given them reason to continue, to build, to hope, and in the harsh beauty of the Arizona desert, that was miracle enough. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I'd love to know where you're listening from. Please share in the comments below so we can connect and share our thoughts about Eloise and Cass's journey. If you enjoyed this tale from the Old West, please subscribe to Wild West Night. Hit that like button and press the hype button to help more people discover these stories of love, redemption, and the courage to begin again.